The St. Augustine Cathedral stood majestic against the Atlanta skyline, its Gothic spires reaching toward clouds tinged with gold from the setting sun. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over 300 of Atlanta's elite, gathered to witness what society magazines had dubbed the wedding of the year. The air was heavy with the scent of white roses and gardenias, imported specifically for the occasion at a cost that could have funded a small non-profit for a year. Amara Thompson stood before the full-length mirror in the bridal suite, her trembling fingers smoothing non-existent wrinkles from her Vera Wang gown. At 32, she had built a reputation as one of Atlanta's fiercest civil rights attorneys, known for taking on cases that made the old guard uncomfortable. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to marry into that very same old guard. "Baby girl," her mother Regina whispered, adjusting the cathedral-length veil with careful hands. "You're the most beautiful bride I've ever seen," but beneath the pride in her voice lay a whisper of concern that Amara chose to ignore, just as she had for the past 2 years. The love story of Amara Thompson and James Bennett I had been like something out of a modern fairy tale. They'd met at a charity gala where Amara was receiving an award for her pro bono work. James, heir to one of Georgia's oldest banking fortunes, had been immediately captivated by her passionate speech about equal justice. He'd waited afterward to introduce himself, and their conversation had lasted until the cleaning crew started stacking chairs. "We're proof that times are changing," James had said during their engagement interview with Atlanta Society magazine. The photo spread showed them looking perfectly matched, despite their differences, her warm brown skin glowing against his pale complexion, her natural curls styled elegantly beside his golden brown waves. They were the picture of progressive Southern society. But now, standing in the cathedral's bridal suite, Amara felt a flutter of unease. She thought about the slight tensions over the past year, the way James's mother Eleanor's smile never quite reached her eyes, the hushed conversations that stopped when she entered rooms at family gatherings, the subtle suggestions that perhaps she should consider a less confrontational area of law. "Oh, 5 minutes," Miss Thompson, the wedding coordinator, announced, popping her head through the door. Amara's father appeared, distinguished in his tuxedo, his grey-streaked hair perfectly trimmed for the occasion. "Ready, baby?" he asked, offering his arm. "There's still time to catch a flight to anywhere else." He'd meant it as a joke, but something in his tone made Amara's heart skip a beat. "Daddy," stop, she laughed, but it came out slightly strained. "This is my fairy tale ending." As the first notes of the wedding march began to play, Amara took her father's arm. Through the heavy wooden doors, she could hear the rustle of 300 guests rising to their feet, waiting to witness what everyone expected to be a perfect union, a symbol of how far society had come. If only they knew how far it still had to go. Here's the 1,000-word second section of the story. The cathedral's pipe organ filled the vast space with boxes, heir on G-string, each note floating up to the vaulted ceiling like a prayer. Amara's 6 bridesmaids preceded her down the aisle, each wearing deep burgundy gowns that complemented their varying skin tones, a detail she'd insisted on, despite Eleanor Bennett's suggestion that perhaps a more traditional pale pink would be more suitable. In the front pew on the groom's side, Eleanor sat with perfect posture, her silver blonde hair arranged in an immaculate crown of curls. Beside her, James Bennett I gripped his carved wooden cane, his jaw clenched in what might have been emotion or something else entirely. The Bennett family occupied the entire first 3 rows, a sea of pale faces and pastel clothing that seemed to ripple with whispers as each member of the bridal party passed. On the bride's side, the contrast was stark and intentional. Amara's family and friends represented a rainbow of black excellence: doctors, professors, activists, and artists. Her cousin Marcus, a jazz musician with dreadlocks, had politely but firmly refused Eleanor's suggestion that he do something with his hair for the ceremony. Her Aunt Vivian, a civil rights activist who'd marched with Dr. King, wore a magnificent African head wrap that drew disapproving glances from the Bennett clan. As Amara appeared in the doorway on her father's arm, the congregation rose. She heard the collective intake of breath. She knew she looked stunning. The dress hugged her curves before flowing into a tasteful train, and her natural hair had been styled into an elegant crown of curls adorned with crystal pins. James, waiting at the altar, smiled that megawatt smile that had first drawn her in at the charity gala. "Who gives this woman to be married?" Reverend Matthews asked, his resonant voice carrying to the rafters. Robert Thompson, Amara's father, cleared his throat. A retired federal judge, he was not a man given to public displays of emotion, but his voice wavered slightly as he responded, "Her mother and I do." He kissed Amara's cheek, then hesitated a fraction too long before placing her hand in James's. The ceremony proceeded with the weight of tradition. Reverend Matthews spoke of love's patience, love's kindness, love's ability to transcend all boundaries. In the front row, Regina Thompson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Eleanor Bennett sat stone-faced, her French manicured fingers clasped tightly in her lap. During the hymn, Amara caught a glimpse of James's younger sister Charlotte slipping her phone from her designer clutch, typing something quickly. Charlotte had been the only Bennett who'd seemed genuinely welcoming, though lately even she had grown distant, making excuses to miss their weekly lunch dates. The Unity Candle ceremony brought the first visible crack in the perfect facade. As Amara and James moved to light the central candle together, Eleanor's voice carried clearly just like them to want to mix the flames. The comment, surely intended for only her husband's ears, echoed in the sudden silence between musical phrases. James's hand trembled slightly as he held the candle, but he said nothing. Amara's brother Marcus, a corporate lawyer in D.C., shifted in his groomsman position, his face darkening. Even Reverend Matthews paused for a moment before continuing with practiced smoothness, speaking about two becoming one, about love erasing all divisions. The ring ceremony approached, and Amara felt James's palm growing sweaty against hers. She glanced at him, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes kept darting to his mother. She'd seen this behavior before at family events, but had always dismissed it. James was progressive, educated, different from his family, wasn't he? The weight of generations pressed down as Reverend Matthews began the final declarations. The Bennetts had been in Atlanta since before the Civil War, their fortune built on the backs of people who looked like Amara. She'd told herself it didn't matter, that love conquered all, that she and James were building a bridge to a better future. If anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined together in matrimony, Reverend Matthews intoned, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The traditional pause followed, during which Amara could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 300 gazes. She noticed James's slight intake of breath, saw his eyes widen a fraction as he looked past her to the congregation. The rustle of expensive silk preceded Eleanor Bennett's voice. "I object," she announced, rising to her feet with the dignity of generations of Southern aristocracy. Her voice carried no rage, no obvious hatred, just absolute conviction. "I have watched this charade proceed far enough. James, darling, you cannot possibly go through with this. Think of the family name. Think of your future children. Think of—" Mother James interrupted, and Amara felt a surge of relief. He would finally stand up to Eleanor, would finally prove that their love was stronger than prejudice. He turned to face his mother, then looked back at Amara. Time seemed to slow as she registered the change in his expression. Gone was the polished smile, the progressive facade. In its place was something she'd never seen before, or perhaps had refused to see. "Mother," he said again, his voice carrying in the stunned silence, "you're right. This was a mistake." The next moment would play out in slow motion in Amara's nightmares for months to come. As murmurs of shock rippled through the cathedral, as her father half rose from his seat, as her brother took a step forward, James Bennett, scion of old money, self-proclaimed progressive, her supposed soulmate, turned to her with eyes full of something between fear and disgust. The sound of his palm meeting her cheek would echo through Atlanta society for years to come. Here's the 750-word third section of the story. The slap cracked through the cathedral like a gunshot. Amara's crystal hairpins scattered across the marble floor as her head snapped to the side, the sound of their delicate impacts drowned out by the collective gasp of 300 witnesses. Her veil fluttered to the ground in slow motion, like a white flag of surrender. For 3 heartbeats, the cathedral was suspended in absolute silence. Then chaos erupted. Marcus Thompson vaulted over the altar railing, his groomsman's boutonniere falling from his lapel as he lunged toward James. 2 of James's cousins moved to intercept, their polished shoes squeaking against the marble floor. Aunt Vivian's voice rose above the growing tumult, calling on the Lord to witness this shame, while Eleanor Bennett could be heard saying, "Well, really, What did everyone expect? But it was Regina Thompson's quiet, "Oh, baby girl," that cut through Amara's shock. The left side of her face burned, not just from the impact but from the humiliation. She could taste blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. The 2-carat diamond engagement ring felt like it was searing her finger. Through the chaos, she caught Charlotte Bennett filming everything on her phone, her face a mask of calculated indifference. Before Marcus could reach James, Amara's voice sliced through the pandemonium. "Stop." They stop. The word carried all the authority she'd earned in countless courtrooms, all the dignity passed down through generations of strong black women who'd faced worse and survived. The cathedral fell silent again. Amara straightened her spine, using every inch of her 5'9" frame. She turned to face the congregation, conscious of the red mark blooming on her cheek, of her ruined makeup, of the $1,000 veil crumpled at her feet. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "I'd like to thank you all for coming today," she said, as if addressing a jury. "You've witnessed something important, though not what we originally gathered," for she paused, letting her gaze sweep across both sides of the aisle. "You've witnessed the moment when a black woman refused to let someone else write her story." James took a step back, his face flushing. "Amara, I." She held up one hand, and he fell silent. 20 years of ingrained Southern manners warred visibly with his newfound defiance. "Mr. Bennett," she continued, emphasizing his formal name, "just showed everyone exactly who he is. But more importantly, I'm about to show you who I am." She turned to face Eleanor Bennett, who had remained standing, her pearls clutched in one manicured hand. "You objected to this union to preserve your family name. Let me help you with that with deliberate movements." Amara slipped off the engagement ring and placed it on the altar. "I wouldn't want to tarnish your reputation by becoming a Bennett." The whispers started again, but Amara wasn't finished. She faced the congregation once more, noting the phones that had emerged to record the moment. "To everyone who came here expecting a wedding, I apologize for the change in programming. Instead, you're witnessing a resurrection. The death of one woman's foolish dreams and the birth of her wisdom." She took her father's handkerchief as he approached the altar, dabbing gently at her cheek. "Daddy," she said softly, but loud enough to carry, "I believe you mentioned something about a flight to anywhere else." Robert Thompson smiled, tears in his eyes. "Already called a car, baby girl." As if on cue, her bridesmaids formed a protective circle around her. Her mother appeared with her emergency bag. Regina Thompson hadn't raised a fool, after all. The Bennett family sat in stunned silence as Amara's people executed an exit strategy that spoke of generations of experience in handling hostile situations with grace. Just before reaching the cathedral doors, Amara turned one last time. The sunset streaming through the stained glass painted colors across her brown skin, transforming the red mark on her cheek into a badge of honor rather than a mark of shame. "Oh, and Charlotte," she called out, "make sure you get my good side for your social media. I'd hate for anyone to miss this lesson in dignity." With that, Amara Thompson walked out of St. Augustine's Cathedral into the Atlanta evening, leaving behind a shattered facade of racial progress and taking with her an unshakable sense of her own worth. Here's the 1,000-word fourth section of the story. By midnight, the video had gone viral. Charlotte Bennett's carefully curated Instagram story, meant to humiliate Amara, instead sparked a national conversation. The hashtag AmaraStrong trended alongside Bennett's shame, with social media lighting up in a blaze of support and outrage. Amara sat in her father's study, still wearing her wedding dress, watching the story unfold on multiple screens. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since she'd left the cathedral. Between messages of support from friends and colleagues, there were interview requests from every major network. The New York Times had already called twice. "You don't owe them anything," Regina said, bringing her daughter a cup of chamomile tea. Not a single word. But Amara was already formulating a strategy. Years of legal training had taught her to recognize pivotal moments, and this was bigger than personal humiliation. As she scrolled through social media, she saw her story being woven into a larger narrative about race, privilege, and the facade of progress in the South. The first surprise came at 2 a.m. when Charlotte Bennett called. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't post that video to hurt you. I've been documenting everything for months, the family meetings about how to stop the wedding, James's private conversations with mother, all of it. I knew something would happen. I didn't think it would be this bad. Amara put the call on speaker so her parents could hear. Why, Charlotte? Because my family needs to be exposed, Charlotte replied. I grew up watching them destroy people while maintaining their perfect public image. When James started dating you, I thought maybe things would change. But instead I have recordings, Amara. Hours of them. They planned this humiliation for months. The next morning, as Amara prepared for a press conference, the second surprise arrived. Theodore Bennett, James's 85-year-old grandfather and the family patriarch, was wheeled into her law office by his private nurse. Young lady, he said, his voice wavering but determined, I've come to apologize for my family's disgrace. I fought in the civil rights era on the wrong side. I've lived long enough to see my children perpetuate the same hatred I was taught. It ends now. He handed her a folder containing internal documents from Bennett Banking Trust, evidence of systematic discrimination in lending practices, redlining and targeted predatory loans in predominantly black neighborhoods. Maybe an attorney with your skills can put this to good use, he said. The press conference was held on the steps of the same courthouse where Amara had won her first civil rights case. She wore a white pantsuit, the bruise on her cheek deliberately uncovered. Cameras flashed as she approached the podium. Yesterday, I was meant to marry into one of Atlanta's most prominent families, she began. Instead, I was given an opportunity to expose the polite facade of racism that still plagues our society. James Bennett didn't just strike me, he struck every person who has ever been told they don't belong, that they should be grateful for conditional acceptance, that they should silently endure humiliation to maintain someone else's comfort. As she spoke, her law firm's partners stood behind her in solidarity. They announced the creation of a new civil rights division, focused on economic justice and banking discrimination. Theodore Bennett's documents would be their first case. The Bennett family's response was swift and predictable. Their Puerto Rico team released a statement claiming James had acted under extreme emotional distress and that the family had always supported diversity. But Charlotte's videos told a different story. One by one, they leaked online Eleanor Bennett discussing ways to prevent that woman. From accessing the family trust, James laughing with his cousins about keeping the bloodline pure, family lawyers strategizing how to protect assets when the marriage inevitably fails. By week's end, Bennett Banking Trust stock had plummeted. Long-buried complaints from former employees and clients surfaced, painting a picture of systemic discrimination spanning decades. James resigned from his position as VP under pressure from the board. Eleanor Bennett's charitable foundation board members began to distance themselves. But the most profound impact was on social media, where thousands of people began sharing their own stories of polite racism, of masks slipping, of moments when they were reminded that acceptance was conditional on their silence and compliance. Amara received a handwritten note from a young law student. I watched you walk out of that cathedral with your head high, and I finally found the courage to walk out of my own compromising situation. Thank you for showing us that our dignity is not negotiable. The national dialogue shifted. Pundits and commentators debated the broader implications. Some defended the Bennetts, arguing that one emotional moment shouldn't define a family. Others pointed out that the slap was merely the visible manifestation of violence that had been present all along in policies, in practices, in whispered comments and closed doors. 3 weeks after the wedding that wasn't, Amara sat in her office, reviewing applications for the Civil Rights Division. Her phone buzzed with a text from Charlotte Mothers on CNN, trying to salvage the family name. They still don't get it. Amara smiled, touching her healed cheek. Her mother had always told her that God didn't give you the lessons you wanted, but the ones you needed. This very public humiliation had become a catalyst for change, not just for her, but for others who watched and recognized their own stories in hers. As she sorted through the day's mail, she found another wedding invitation. A former client was marrying into another prominent Southern family. On the RSVP card, the bride had written, "You taught me to verify a man's character, not just his credentials. Thank you." Amara checked "will attend" and added a note, "No need to seat me near the altar. I have a perfect view of truth from anywhere in the room. Here's the 750-word fifth section of the story." Sitting in her therapist's office a month after the incident, Amara finally allowed herself to acknowledge the red flags she'd ignored. The memories came in waves, each one sharper than the last. There was the Christmas party, she said, twisting the tissue in her hands. James's father made a joke about how I was one of the good ones. Instead of defending me, James laughed and squeezed my hand under the table, as if asking me to play along. I told myself he was just keeping the peace. Dr. Williams, a black woman in her 60s who'd lived through her own share of polite racism, nodded knowingly. We often mistake cowardice for diplomacy when we're invested in a particular outcome. Another memory surfaced, James suggesting she wear her hair straight for their engagement photos. The natural look is beautiful, honey, he'd said, but let's give mother something more traditional. She'd spent 6 hours at the salon, transforming her curls into what Eleanor Bennett would consider acceptable. I became smaller, Amara realized, her voice breaking. Piece by piece, I was folding myself into spaces too tight to hold me. But as she unpacked these painful revelations, Amara was far from alone. Her support system had transformed into something extraordinary. Her bridesmaids, all successful black women in their own right, created a weekly dinner circle where they shared similar stories of compromise and resistance. Her mother, who'd held her tongue for 2 years, finally shared her own experiences of navigating interracial relationships in the 1980s. The problem wasn't that you loved a white man, Regina told her over Sunday dinner. The problem was that you loved one who wanted you to be grateful for his love, as if it was a gift rather than an exchange between equals. Amara's law firm partners, initially concerned about potential fallout, witnessed their practice growing stronger. Women of all races sought them out, drawn by the image of Amara's dignity in crisis. The firm's new civil rights division had a waiting list of qualified attorneys wanting to join. Marcus, her protective brother, helped in his own way. As a corporate lawyer, he used his connections to ensure the Bennett Banking Trust investigation received proper attention. But more importantly, he shared his own guilt. I saw it coming, he admitted one evening. But I thought speaking up would make me look like the angry black man who couldn't accept his sister's happiness. I let respectability politics silence me. The community impact rippled outward. Local churches began hosting discussions about internalized racism and the difference between integration and acceptance. Amara was invited to speak at universities, where students shared their own stories of compromising their identity for acceptance. During one such talk, a young woman stood up. "My white fiancé tells me I'm too sensitive about race issues," she said. "He says love should be colorblind." Amara's response became a viral quote, "Love shouldn't be colorblind. It should see color, celebrate it, and stand firmly against anyone who would diminish its beauty." The personal growth came in unexpected moments. Amara began wearing her hair in elaborate African styles, embracing the beauty she'd sometimes muted. She took up space unapologetically in boardrooms and courtrooms, no longer worried about appearing too strong or too black. One Saturday, she visited her grandmother's grave, laying flowers and sitting in quiet reflection. "You tried to tell me, Big Mama," she whispered. "Remember when you met James and just said, 'Baby, a man who loves you will never ask you to shrink.'" Her grandmother's wisdom, once dismissed as old-fashioned, now felt prophetic. Amara had learned that love shouldn't require a sacrifice of self, that compromise shouldn't mean erasure, and that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away. The healing wasn't linear. Some days the humiliation still stung, but more often Amara felt gratitude for the public nature of her awakening. Her private pain had become a public lesson, giving others permission to examine their own compromises. In her journal she wrote, "I thought James would be my bridge to acceptance in their world. Instead, his slap burned that bridge and forced me to build my own foundation. Sometimes the most loving thing the universe can do is stop us from settling for less than we deserve." The entry ended with a quote from Maya Angelou that had become her mantra: "You may not control all the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them." Here's the 750-word 6th section of the story. 6 months after the wedding that wasn't, Amara stood at another podium, this time facing a packed press conference at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. The symbolism of the location wasn't lost on anyone, a place commemorating past struggles now bearing witness to present-day reckonings. "Today we're announcing a class action lawsuit against Bennett Banking Trust," she declared, her voice steady. "The evidence reveals decades of systematic discrimination that goes far beyond my personal experience. This isn't about a wedding gone wrong. This is about power, privilege, and the institutions that perpetuate them. Behind her stood a coalition that would have been unimaginable 6 months ago. Charlotte Bennett, now estranged from her family but standing firm in her role as key witness. Theodore Bennett, frail but resolute in his wheelchair. Dozens of former Bennett banking employees and clients, and civil rights leaders from across the country. The lawsuit detailed everything: predatory lending practices targeting black communities, internal emails joking about urban applicants, promotion patterns that consistently overlooked qualified minorities. Charlotte's documented evidence proved invaluable, showing how the personal prejudices of the Bennett family had infected their corporate culture. My brother's actions at the altar weren't an isolated incident of lost temper. Charlotte testified in her deposition. They were the physical manifestation of generations of practiced superiority. The only difference is, this time it was caught on camera. The legal proceedings sparked something larger. Banking while black began trending as thousands shared their stories of financial discrimination. Other banks faced similar scrutiny. The Federal Reserve launched an investigation into discriminatory lending practices across the southern banking industry. James, who'd initially retreated to a family estate in South Carolina, attempted damage control through a PR firm. His public apology rang hollow. "I deeply regret my actions, which were out of character and resulted from the stress of the situation." The statement conspicuously avoided addressing the systemic issues or his family's role in perpetuating them. Eleanor Bennett, however, doubled down. In a disastrous Fox News interview, she defended traditional banking practices and claimed her family was being persecuted. The backlash was swift. Her charitable foundation's remaining board members resigned en masse. Within the broader Bennett clan, battle lines were drawn. Younger family members, inspired by Charlotte's courage, began speaking out about their own misgivings. Thanksgiving dinner would never be the same. Some chose silence, retreating behind gated communities and country club memberships. Others, particularly those under 40, reached out to Amara privately, sharing their own journeys of unlearning inherited prejudice. Theodore Bennett, in what would be his last public appearance, testified via video for the lawsuit. "I won't live to see the changes this case will bring," he said, "but I can die knowing I finally chose the right side of history." He passed away 2 weeks later, having changed his will to establish a scholarship fund for minority students pursuing careers in finance. The movement grew beyond banking. Companies across industries faced renewed scrutiny of their diversity practices. The phrase Bennett test entered the corporate lexicon, referring to the gap between public diversity statements and private practices. Amara's parents hosted Sunday dinners for a growing chosen family: activists, journalists, students, and even a few reformed Bennett cousins. These gatherings became known for their frank discussions about race, power, and the possibility of genuine reconciliation. The path forward isn't about forgetting or even necessarily forgiving, Amara explained in a powerful TED Talk that autumn. It's about acknowledging truth, dismantling harmful systems, and building something better. Sometimes it takes a public slap to wake us from private complacency. The lawsuit would eventually settle for a historic sum, with Bennett Banking Trust agreeing to major structural changes and external oversight. But the real victory was in the conversations it sparked, the awareness it raised, and the changes it inspired in other institutions. One evening, as Amara left her office, she found Charlotte waiting by her car. "Dad's will reading is tomorrow," Charlotte said. "The family's splintering. Some are selling their shares, others want to fight the reforms. But I wanted you to know that slap didn't just wake you up, it woke some of us up too." Amara hugged her almost sister-in-law, both women crying for different yet intertwined reasons. Sometimes, she realized, true family is found in the aftermath of losing what you thought was family. Sometimes, justice comes not in the form you expect, but in the form you need. The sun was setting over Atlanta, casting long shadows across the city's mix of antebellum architecture and modern high-rises, a fitting metaphor for a South still wrestling with its past while reaching for a different future.